What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. I'm Scott here with Michael and Drew. As always, this is the Elder Scrolls podcast, and today we are talking all about the Reach folk, the native men inhabitants of the Reach. And you've probably had some exposure to them by at the very least playing Skyrim in the form of the Forsworn, but we're going to get into them more broadly.
And I think one of the most interesting things about the Reachmen is that for as long as they've been around, they're still yet to be essentially annihilated or conquered to the point where you don't see their culture anymore. You know, you look at all of the coolest cultures and civilizations. I mean, it's all subjective, but like some of my favorite would be things like the Snow Elves, or we know a lot of Elder Scrolls fans love the Dwemer, there's the Kaimer, but then the Reachmen, they're still around despite not being as, you know, technologically advanced or magically advanced. They're definitely more of a primitive people, but they're still there. And obviously when I say their culture's still around, I should also say that their culture is still quite diverse. With like, there's lots of micro cultures within it and different clans with different practices, but they've still kept that core kind of like natural, barbaric, live in the land and by the rules of the land, and of course the Daedric princes that many of them worship, which though do relate back to that whole nature theme, because that's how they see them.
In ways, I feel like it would be comparable to sort of, in terms of describing their culture, kind of going like, imagine like in the way that outsiders will go like, oh, Native American cultures of like the United States, all the indigenous peoples there, they would go like, oh, you know, Native Americans. But that doesn't actually tell you a lot at how like diverse and different all of the individual cultures are. There are some, of course, similarities by virtue of being in the same geography, but there is, well, even then there's different parts of geography, but you know what I'm getting at. That overall they've got quite a different sort of, It's like kind of an ancient sort of way of looking at things. You know how you would have like ancient city-states and so on. They have like patron gods. Like for example, like the ancient Greeks would see themselves as very different from, you know, Athens versus Sparta or Corinth or whatnot. But they sort of all share a similar cultural elements or stories or gods and stuff.
When compared to cultures from completely different places and times and stuff.
Yeah, well, like I guess it's a thing on all culture in general. The further you go along in any sort of timeline, like on Earth or even the Elder Scrolls, generally monoliths form, and you get a big culture that sort of ends up dominating everything else and erasing the smaller ones. So where you do get those small ones, like the Reachmen, that sort of are preserved, there's less homogenous components of their religion.
I think it's impressive for multiple reasons as well, because not much about their culture is truly built to last. You know, they don't have, like, let's say the Aliens, they have these grand citadels where, you know, even once they're gone, time and the weather can come along and it still endures and you can still see remnants of it. But the Reach folk have always been in a highly contested area of Tamriel where lots of powers over history have vied for control of it. Yet they've endured despite not really having architecture built to endure. It's like them as a people have endured. And it's not for want of trying, because plenty of cultures, as we're going to get into, have tried to eradicate them or push them out. Yet they remain the Reach folk, named after the area that they inhabit, and still do.
Yeah, and they've also done a lot more than just survive at different points in history, of course. Obviously, when you play Skyrim, it looks like their presence has dwindled quite a bit. But obviously, as we'll talk about, there were times in history when they basically sat on the Ruby Throne. Well, they did. They had a whole dynasty, so...
And I mean, even in the earliest of times, when you've got characters like Red Eagle dealing with the power of the Cyrodiilic Empire under Empress Hestra, you know, these are early days when, aside from some magic and myth, there's not a whole lot about the Reach folk that you could say, oh, there's no chance they would be able to hold up against the might of an empire. Yet for a very long time they did, and even when the empire comes along and tries to crush them, they continue to exist and rise from the ashes.
Funnily enough, though, I do feel like a lot of it, I'm a huge Reachmen fan, but I feel like a big reason why they endure is geography. They just win because of that. Like, anywhere, mountainous areas are notoriously hard to subdue. You know, they can duck away into caves and tunnels and survive. Like, you know, I mean, even recent like understanding, but it's like why part of the reason like Afghanistan was such a big ordeal is because you can't really control all of that area effectively. It's just too, and especially for these tribes and so on that live there for so long. Similar kind of deal with the Reachmen. It's just like even if you do have Empress Hestra roll in and say they are successful and they take the Reach, so many Reachmen and their little tribes and so on can stay isolated and survive in their lifestyles everywhere and all around. It's just, exactly how they're dealing with the Forsworn uprising in the sort of fourth era kind of times. The Forsworn, they just go to the hills. They know the hills. They live there. They've been living there for thousands of years. It's very hard to kind of root them all out and effectively destroy forever. Although it's not the most enjoyable experience for the Reachmen because then they're also just living as like guerrilla fighters in the hills for their, existence.
They also, we should say though, they do have on their side some very powerful and ancient magics. Obviously nothing compared to the strength amassed by an entire empire, but you see with the Hagravens and the Briarhearts, like the Reach folk are, as much as they have a big focus on toughness and physical prowess, they do also have these almost maternal figures in the case of the Hagravens, providing them with, help in battle and defense, and also guidance and creating the Briarhearts, and those become, magically, kind of like super soldiers, essentially, of the Reach.
Well, like that's actually, maybe it's a good segue to go straight into the origin story, but the Briarheart ritual in itself is a very, beyond just the sort of physical things that it gives, is actually a very symbolic and like religiously significant group. So to clarify, say broadly about all of the Reachmen, there are what they consider great spirits, which are generally Daedra, Daedric princes, but theoretically there's others, like Lorcan is another great spirit, but he's kind of like, what is he or whatever. It doesn't really necessarily fit neatly into that picture, but they'll also have a situation where they have like veneration and worship of ancestors, or it could be like certain sort of more niche things. Like it could even theoretically be like a ghost of a river spirit type kind of vibe thing. Like it depends on individual cultures, but there's some great spirits that are generally recognized. And this sort of, I guess if we were to start with their creation story, it's basically this. There was the void, and there's all of these there's all of the spirits within it, and so on. But Lorcan, comes to Namira, who is the queen of this spirit realm.
The cream.
The queen. But she, and then basically basically says, I want to create this sort of world, somewhere for wayward spirits, a sort of separate realm. And then part of this, though, is he had to like sacrifice his own heart in its creation and so on. And then, the world's created, but Lorcan's dead in it. And this is where Hersine takes over as the lord of the realm of flesh, a lord of the arena, like harkening back to the idea that, arena, the game, it's called because Tamriel's an arena or whatnot. But so then basically you have the dichotomy of the realm of spirit realm, basically, which is, the void, and Namira is the queen of that. And then you've got the realm of flesh where Hersine is the king of this sort of dichotomy. And the fundamental sort of idea is that this is a realm of like suffering and a way of learning, like pain is wisdom, and that's how they sort of embrace the pain rather than cower away from it as the other cultures of Tamriel do. And so in that, that's why Hersine's, like, they regard the great spirits as lessons, and Hersine's lessons and how to live and thrive in this sort of society. And the idea is that through life, when you finally die in Namira, you go back to Namira, and then Namira is more or less going to like see what you've learned through this experience and then like kind of send you back. It's like your lives are a process of like learning and like harsh, you know what I mean? Like
and this is all fairly recent lore that really helps to flesh out the Reach folk, because we knew about Briarhearts before truly knowing the reason they would do this. Like, you've got, it harkens back to, was Red Eagle the first Briarheart?
I'm pretty sure there are. It might have changed. I think that was the assumption in Skyrim, but maybe there's expanded in Ygr, so I actually can't remember.
But like we've once you establish their religion and their belief in Lorc, and Lorc sacrificing his heart for the realm, it really puts into perspective the importance of the Briarhearts in their culture. Because like replacing your heart with the Briar is in some way representative of you sacrificing the same way Lorc sacrificed for your people to be able to exist.
Yeah, and too, like in that the significance of that sort of ceremony, I guess we could say broadly that the Reachmen are quite a ceremonial and sort of religious. Religious gives a different kind of impression. It makes you think sort of like, you know, priests in a temple kind of thing. But I guess spirituality is important in their everyday. In their everyday lives, because they're embodied as lessons. All of these.
Well, they live they kind of live their truth. You know, it's similar to Boethra with the early Khajiit mythology, where you walk the path to worship Boethra to the Khajiit. You don't just get down on your knees and pray and hope everything will go, you know, I hope everything will be swell. The Reachmen are quite similar in that sense. They kind of live the truth. They still do revere them, but a lot of it would be in kind of like sacrifices, like you said, or like kind of disturbing rituals, depending on the, you know, the deity that they're worshipping. If it's Namira particularly, there's some kind of like grotesque rituals involved there. But you know, they are that kind of people, and it's almost similar to Dark Elves in a way, in the terms of having that kind of like Lorcan's truth lesson, and like, you know, basically transcendence through challenge, and like overcoming challenge to grow. Yeah, it's obviously a bit different to the Dark Elves, but it falls along similar lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to in saying that too, there is also the I think the Vatrons, they're called, which are basically your law keepers or history takers. Make it, you know, they record all the histories and so on, but they don't record with writing. This is basically largely an illiterate society or culture. It's all oral tradition and so on. So also in that respect, it kind of makes it hard sometimes to get. Naturally, the written word lends itself to, you know, a Bible or a book or some sort of uniform kind of teaching about things, whereas if they're all relying on oral stories and so on, little tweaks and, you know, game of Chinese whispers and so on, lasting forever, that can also change the way their cultures work, and that's how you get so much diversity within.
What did you say those songkeeper types were called? It's
Vatrons?
Vatrons, yeah. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, if it's like Vatestrans, but I think it's Vatrons.
Here's a really cool little tidbit I found. There's an item called the Witchwise Headdress, right? And it's kind of like got a skull and rams. I'll put it up. But it says, this is its description. It's from the ESO, but it says, Reach legends claim the witch, Nainra Wea, I think it's Wea or Were or whatever, wore a headdress like this when creating the Umbra Sword. To honor her, Reach witches who passed the final test of wisdom and power, set to them by her clan elders, the privilege to craft one of their own. Anyway, the point there is, so you know the witch that created Umbra. This is indicating that she was actually a Reachmen witch character, which I just thought was cool. So it's like an ancient Reach witch made the Umbra Sword, which is kind of cool, I thought.
Yeah.
It just is a little tidbit while we're on the side there. But yeah, so I guess we could go like if we wanted to start with like the biggest origins, or at least how they believe of where they are. The Reachmen believe that they were there forever. Ever since when Lorcan created the world, they went into the caves and so on, and I guess functionally lived as cavemen or whatnot in the Reach. And then it wasn't until, so even then, it kind of depends on like whether you take their mythology or what kind of view of history you take, or whether the elves came first or all of that kind of stuff. There's a cool video coming out soon about where I claim that the Nidic humans were indigenous to Tamriel, or at least there far before the elves.
Just don't tell the Thalmor.
Yeah, exactly. But the reason for this, it makes a lot more sense. And then you'll have the Nordic and Elven peoples, you know, the Dureni and High Rock and so on, coming forward, expanding their thing. You got the Nords coming from the east, expanding into the Reach that way, and that fighting over that area probably has had some cultural influence, but largely that's what sort of changes their biology over time and makes them closer to Bretons. Although it varies, like you hear some are built more like Nords, and you know, far more Nordic blood, and they're taller, more muscular, and then some are far more Breton-like or perhaps Nidic. There's probably some isolate. It's kind of hard, I guess, over thousands and thousands of years. It's kind of hard to probably like find any cultures that are like just like pure-blooded Needs or whatever, like Need Reachmen or whatnot. But yeah, so that's where all things started along. So at the very least, you're looking at the Merethic era, but beyond that, you know, there's 4,500 years of recorded history, which they've always been a part of.
Yeah.
So
And
they've
I know-
been around for a long time.
I know in the Elder Scrolls Online as well, like you still, there's a lot of Reachmen you can interact with in the game. Actually, if you open the list of names, a lot of them don't have dialogue, but there are a lot of Reachmen there with unique names. And they kind of talk about like, they're diverse in appearance. Some are more like Nords and big and strong and muscular, and some are more like short and, more agile and lithe. So it's kind of this idea that they've intermingled with a variety of races over the years.
Another thing, I guess, is a bit of my speculation, but the way that traditionally, like a lot of like dynasties and lineages and stuff like that, there's a very like a big cultural emphasis on blood and like blood relation, like father to son and so on. Whereas if you kind of come from amongst the Reachmen, there are people who are in your clan. Often, they're usually parts of your family, but there's people that can become adopted into clans and so on. And if you have different cultural conceptions of the importance of blood relation versus kind of accepted relations, like back in the day, ancient people didn't necessarily have these like sort of hardline conceptions of genetics and so on. So if you sometimes you do like blood ceremonies and you're where you cut the palms and do that and you become blood brothers, they take that as literally as you are genetically related to me in terms of how important it is to them culturally. So you can imagine potentially this could be a similar thing with the Reachmen, given that they're already very open to adopting other members of the clan and so on. And especially if you have like, there would be people like someone's a child of a Reachman and a Nord, and then that person is more Nordic or whatnot, but they get, do you know what I mean? Like it's less a racial thing, more of a culture.
A lot of these attitudes do spring from cultures where, as we discussed before, history is being documented, your culture is being documented, and you've got the importance of your legacy, your family tree. If you're looking through, say, Western European history through the Middle Ages, you have all the dynasties of all of the kings and lords and all of that stuff. But if you just have oral traditions and you're not obsessed with putting your name down in history and things like that, it does shift the focus of what is actually important. It's more about the unity of your tribe and the strength and your ability to survive and have children and whatnot, rather than putting your family name in the history books.
Yeah. And I suppose in the Elder Scrolls as well, like a lot of these rituals that they could do to kind of like become family, probably real, or have some kind of impact. Like, you do some, like you said, some Blood Brothers thing, and you do it while doing a ritual to Lorcan or her scene, probably.
Just to clarify there, that was my like additional speculation or so on. I was only
they just have the
actual ceremony.
Yeah,
they could do that instead.
We're brothers now.
Yeah, come brothers. Let's go. But anyway, so it's hard to like talk about the Reach folks' culture in their totality, but at the core, they really appreciate hardship, and you could also see that even up into the modern day, that their rejection of modern equipment, they still use their traditional sort of hides and stone weapons and stuff like that. And if you see that more as a cultural rejection of being able to like kind of live off the land as you have forever and so on, and as like a sort of, that's how they distinguish themselves against the Nord invaders and stuff, or the Elven invaders and so on. Mm-hmm. Perhaps that explains a little bit more about their desire to live a hard life, kind of might inform their sort of dress and so on. But
one thing I do want to say before we move on, though, in regards to their history, they do, like those Vatrons, if we call them that, they are obsessed with recording like the people, the clans, the history. Like every leader that falls, every warrior that bleeds, the Vatron knows them all. Each who survived the rites earn a Vatron song. Okay, that's unrelated, probably a bit cringe, but the history of the Reach, its people, its relics, I know them all, because if I didn't, they'd be lost.
So we just got a few guys who know all of this.
Yeah, supposedly. I guess you have, and they've really played up the real kind of like old, hobbled almost aesthetic, because you got to be hobbled for the extra wisdom points when you're old.
I guess that's one of those awkward things where things are very important at one time in history, but then we have games that came out earlier that are much more advanced, that have absolutely no record of any of this stuff. So it kind of starts to contradict itself.
Yeah. They're also responsible for the ritualistic commemoration of dead ancestors through music and song.
Yeah. But also, I guess we can start moving on the history. Like, the point is that these guys have been in the Reach for basically as long as history on Tamriel has been recorded. They've been there. But like you sort of mentioned earlier, Drew, the first big significant thing, I'm pretty sure, would be the Phelan and his uprising against the Empress Hestra, because this is the first time you've got the Elysian Empire from Cyrodiil and so on is actually actively kind of expanding, and they're going into High Rock and stuff like that. Nothing compared to the later Reachmen and Tiber Septim empires, but they are trying, and this is where you get the whole story of Red Eagle, which Phelan just means Red Eagle in their language, and he kind of fails in the end anyway. But
it was written in the name.
Yeah,
Phelan.
But he kind of becomes a sort of like a bit of a, almost like an Arthurian figure and stuff for the Reachmen and so on, like this kind of he'll return one day kind of vibe, and he's a symbolic hero of their people. But funnily enough, as you move further on, like you're mentioning, the big one that a lot of their lore came in with ESO, but it is the rise of Durkarak, the Black Drake, who never called himself king, because among the Reach people, they culturally view people who kneel and follow a king as different. Instead, it's kind of like he was a very charismatic and great individual, also made some like pacts with like Merin's Dagon and stuff in the background, but with the, I forgot the name, it's like Torialak or something like that. It's like these wizard group basically that helped Durkarak, this Reachmen wizard group that helped Durkarak. You might find that there in a bit. But anyway, Durkarak basically convinces all of the Reachmen to follow him, and they go on this. He becomes a functional like war leader, and then goes on and conquers Cyrodiil. He gets killed by King Emmerich when he tries to take High Rock, but regardless, his son Morikar and his grandson Leovic rule the empire for a decent period of time as what are called the Longhouse dynasty. And it all goes south for them when Emperor Leovic, so Durkarak's grandson, he legalizes Daedra worship, and that was a step too far for people, and the Duke Varan Aquilarios makes a rebellion and basically deposes Leovic, and that's the end of the Reachmen's, like that's when they peaked, I guess, in terms of political power.
So how long were they actually kind of ruling? It's quite a long
I think
time,
it's
isn't it?
60 or something years. It's 3 generations, but Durkarak sort of had to do a lot of the conquering and establishment. So
because Durkarak was born in 485 and died in 541, supposedly.
Yeah, let me find that for you.
Well, it's a guess. It's a guess, actually, around 485.
As far as we know, that it's quite unlike the Reachmen to really push outside of what they consider their own land. So for the Longhouse Emperors, for Durkarak to have ambitions so lofty to move into Cyrodiil, to take the Empire, and then to move into High Rock, it's quite unheard of for this race. And, as we were talking about before, they rely on their advantage being that they know their land and it's very difficult to invade it. And inevitably, no matter how brilliant these leaders might have been, the ambition of having Cyrodiil, the Reach, and High Rock might have been a bit too much for any Reachman.
Bit of a stretch. Well, it all ties in with the which I haven't fully explored, the 4 ambitions and so on in the Blackwood expansion and so on, to really explain like how they got so ambitious to take everything. But Durkarak the Black Drake makes himself emperor in 533, and Empress and Morikar dies 64.
But Leovic then takes over after Morikar.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
And Leovic is the last one who basically, I'm pretty sure, Varan comes in and storms the Imperial City. That's Varan Aquilarios.
Yeah, 77.
577, yeah.
So 33 to 77. So 44 years. Yeah, so 44 years. I mean, not
That's
a
a
bad
long
run.
time
That's nearly
for-
half a century.
It's like a long time too to think that they were, because it's so foreign to think. I mean, like even with the like Akaviri potentates, you have like eventually you have like a Saesi running the show. You know, it's like funny to think that so many different cultures have sat on the Ruby Throne.
And it's funny that at that point they would have by far accepted just that dragon blood's not really a big deal or thing, because no one with dragon blood, like the potentate run Reachmen Empire runs for longer than the Reachmen run Reachmen Empire did. So it's kind of like for 400 or 500 years or whatever. So they're, you know, it's I guess they wouldn't be as opposed necessarily to a rule. I mean, they definitely were by the time Daedra worship starts getting like legalized and so on. But I guess that's the Reachmen's biggest impact politically on the realm of Tamriel itself. Usually it's them getting impacted.
And and Dirkrak went to the Deadlands because of his pacts with Dagon, I believe, in death. He's in the Deadlands with Dagon.
Yeah, I haven't gone all in on this new Blackwood.
I believe he's Dirkrak's there, yeah. And I mean, who can blame him? You can see a lot of like Reachmen culture. They can enjoy Dagon in a completely different way to most cultures would, because sure, destruction, but that's more like a natural thing. Like, you know, they think about hardship. You've got earthquakes, thunderstorms, I don't know, rock slides, you can imagine in the Reach, probably all these kinds of things. And then of course Dagon has the big ambition element, which seems more important to the Reach folk when it comes to Dagon, at least. So some of them turn that way. It is interesting though, and I should specify, because I quite enjoy the culture and religion and stuff of the Reachmen. Like, that's probably my favorite aspect of them. But they don't really have, in the same way that other cultures do, exactly the same like pantheon kind of approach to everything. So like you'll look at a lot of different elven cultures, kind of the cultures of humans as well. They'll have this pantheon, and it's like, I've got this god, you know, I've got my 8 or 9 divines, and I've got these different, you know, even the Khajiit, while they don't really make a strong distinction between like, this is Aedra, this is Daedra, they kind of worship both. A lot of the Reachmen worship, you know, you might have your main ones in there, like your, you know, Lorcan, Namira, Hircine, but then you do get clans that are very like deity centric. Like, we're a clan who specifically really likes to revere Nocturnal, for example, who'll send her crows to watch over us and make sure everything's safe.
It's that real ancient sort of mindset where the existence of other cultures' gods or other gods doesn't nullify the existence of your own. It's like, oh, that's your god or your spirit that you revere or whatnot, rather than sort of, no, this is the true way. It's not Akatosh, it's Oriel or whatnot. So that changes.
And they've made alliances with some interesting beings over time, such as Minotaurs. In one point, I know in the Elder Scrolls Online, there's the Dreadhorde clan who ally with Minotaurs to capture Falkreath.
I think that's always such a cool aesthetic, the idea that if they allied themselves with Minotaurs, or I know there's some Monster Skyrim that adds like centaurs there or so on. Like, I feel like they could be much more in touch with the, you know.
Well, they are meant to be like, I know centaurs at least are very mysterious and very ancient, and you can imagine that I could imagine them serving some kind of like Hagraven kind of like queen who's like very like, you know, in touch with old hedge magics and things like that.
And there are a few races like that seem to like fall out of favor or have something bad happen to them historically, and then they just fade out of history, and we just assume they've lost all their intelligence. Like, this is the case for the Minotaurs, it's the case for the Falmer, it's the case for the Dregs,
goblins,
and the idea that they could be utilized and kind of like important again in future events. It's like, it would be good to see more of that, especially with the Minotaurs being around. It's an untapped resource since the really cool Elysian Order lore.
Yeah. I wonder how early some of those ties could have happened too, because the idea, if you buy into the theory, which I do personally, that, you know, all of the Minotaurs are a product of you know, Morahouse and Elysia getting it on and so on, and so that they're very attached to the Empire, and they were guardians of the Empire in its very first days. But then obviously the Elysian Order came about, and they became quite zealous and anti anything that's not human. When at that time, if they were pushed to the boundaries, it's kind of like maybe they linked up with other Nedic groups around the place, at that time, who themselves, to be honest, might have been pushed to the barrier, because of the expansion of things like, the Dwemer or Falmer or so on. They might have been pushed. Oh, to be honest, even the Nords. Like, I mean, we've got to remember, humans fight humans too. Like, Nords could have come and like wiped Nedic tribes and so on, and fought against them as well.
Well, they definitely tried to wipe out the Reachmen on multiple occasions, didn't they?
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the Battle of Old Hroldan in the 9th century of the Second Era.
You mentioned interesting alliances, but them being allied with the Second Aldmeri Dominion in that battle as part of it is kind of interesting there.
Yeah.
But
ultimately, you get King Kulakane coming in, and that's what I think forces them to kind of like set up shop and fortify at Old Hroldan. But then there's this whole story of like basically the Thu'um magic comes in, and the Colovians and the Nords basically take Old Hroldan from the Reachmen easily. And then Markarth and the Reach end up with a lot of Nord influence.
Real quick, interestingly enough, if you see King Kulakane, it does sound like a more Reachmanish sounding name. Like, it doesn't necessarily sound like a Nordic name to me, or rather even a Colovian name. It doesn't really sound like, because the Colovian names generally, like the types usually go for more like Slavic sort of name types and so on, like Rizlav Larek or whatnot. And
with Reach folk, it's more Celtic.
Yeah, and that does, and potentially it is a sort of a scenario where maybe he was a half-breed or like something like that. That's another thing, I guess, too.
There's Emperor Zero for anyone wondering, like basically who was succeeded by Tiber Septim.
Yeah, he's the emperor that never became emperor, but it was his intention to become emperor, and then Tiber Septim, his general, became emperor in his stead and continued to lead.
And was he betrayed by...
Well, yeah. I mean, I sort of buy into it.
Hazy days.
Yeah. It's a bit sus, the whole thing.
Clear skies, that one.
But
Scott's favourite shout. Clear skies. And Aura Whisper. He likes Aura Whisper a lot.
Yeah. So I guess in the next part in the history or so on, it's kind of quiet throughout the Third Era, just getting subdued constantly by everyone around them,
and propaganda too. Like the Imperials basically, even before that, basically were like branding them as these outlaws and these rebels and stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, so for when you and bringing that up to the modern era, I think it's when you've got the Great War happening, around the sort of 174 kind of period. Basically, Madanach calls himself king, unites a bunch of the Reachmen, and then takes over Markarth and declares it an independent Reachman kingdom for the Reachmen. And things kind of last for, I think it's like 2 years. It sort of runs.
Actually, quick interjection, sorry, but that is actually interesting when you think about what we were saying earlier about the older and the oldest Reachman tribes and how, wouldn't call him, wouldn't call himself king. Dirk was it?
Yeah, and culturally that was a thing.
And culturally that was a thing. And then you have Madanach saying, I'm king. Yeah. So it's you can see that there are more modern influences kind of just by default that happen over time, or just cultural changes, so that even though we say, oh, it's impressive, they're still there. Yes, they haven't changed too much. They've still changed a fair bit. And the other thing to keep in mind is they are the Forsworn. Like, this is a faction that doesn't like necessarily encapsulate every single Reachman, Like, it's not like every Reachman ever has been like, we're the Forsworn.
Well, you see lots of Reachmen in, like Reachmen, like biologically, like culturally, people in Markarth and so on, with the face tattoos and so on. Like, a lot of these people have just sort of accepted, Nord occupation and so on, and they just want to live like a normal life. Like, they don't want to become, functionally become what the Nords would brand as terrorists, just running all over. They don't want to fight an unwinnable war, functionally.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, Ulfric basically, came in with the whole Markarth incident stuff, and the Reachmen end up getting pushed out, and that's how the Forsworn come about in the first place.
Sorry, I was just looking for a quote. I was there's one here. The Reach folk have a saying: anyone can be a king in the Reach, but no one is king of the Reach. And that's kind of one part, because like often, like lots of them, there are some chiefs that will call themselves king at time, but they always end up failing. Like there's never really a, kind of thing. But yeah, that's just a cool.
It's kind of like that whole like no ownership of the nature. Like the nature is its own sacred thing. That the idea that like I own the Reach, this mountain is mine, which would be a very like empire thing to kind of say like this is my.
They seem to have more of a like an individual sovereignty kind of thing, more so. You know what I mean? Like in terms of freedoms, I guess. Really, it's an easier word to say.
As free as the winds of the rocky peaks of the Reach itself.
I guess too we should loop into, because we'll probably get back to some mythology stuff, but also one thing, a defining part of them, in part could be because of their Breton heritage and stuff as well, that has been influenced over time, but it's this whole hedge magic, reach magic. They're, like we're talking about with Nymira and the Hagravens and so on, but they've got all of these different covens, and sometimes they sort of intermix with other sort of coven groups. And overall, even one of their titles or names that they get called is the Witchmen of High Rock and so on, and it's because they do practice a lot of these dark, and some of these magics would most definitely be assisted by Daedra through sacrifice and stuff like that.
There are a lot of kind of relations with witches. I mean, I know in the Elder Scrolls Online there's the Stone Talon clan, and that's where there's a big Hagraven focus. Like basically the females get transformed into Hagravens. Like it's not like some rare prized thing. It's kind of like it happens, but even the ones who aren't transformed yet, they're still really strong mages, and I suppose at one point they get to that stage where they're like it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that a Briarheart is kind of, well, if they die, but if they're alive, like they're kind of like trading their humanity to become this super soldier of the Reach. But a Hagraven too, who is kind of like responsible for overseeing that ritual, is also a woman who has basically traded her humanity for like super magical powers and this kind of new grotesque, in my opinion at least, appearance.
It's actually interesting too that I was just thinking too, how there was the Glenmoral Coven witches that were in Solstheim. I think there was like Isabel something else and something else, like Frenchish sort of sounding names, right? But they too become Hagravens by the time of the Dragonborn DLC for Solstheim. Interestingly, I wonder how much that sort of, because I mentioned like their covens and the Reachmen sometimes interact and sort of cross over, but even the sort of practice of becoming Hagravens and so on, perhaps like some covens like those three witches and so on adopt it for more practical purposes than the religious significance or whatnot. But
I'm sure a lot would.
It's an interesting
I mean, there's another, I think it's actually from Legends, like one of the scenes from it where you can go and there's dialogue, but they talk about a Reachman tribe who's releasing a poison, and they're going to send it in on the back of like Dwemer automatons that they've kind of like repurposed or something. I'm not the biggest fan of that, but I suppose that's the thing to remember, in the same way that we say like, every Daedric prince will still do individualistic things. They don't have to act in the confines of like their spheres. They can just be like, I'm angry, so I'm going to do this. In the same way, Reachman tribes can just be like, this is practical, we're going to do this at the moment, and it doesn't seem to really fit in with the typical themes.
What do you think? It's interesting to kind of think how Markarth kind of started and prospered, like with the Dwemer, because the Reachmen probably would have been there, depending on when you think the Dwemer came about and so on. But I'm pretty sure most historical records would line up that the Dwemer came after, so they would come and establish this sort of place as well.
I do like how Markarth is quite above ground as well. It's quite interesting because, like, I mean, there are other Dwemer cities that have a lot above ground, but not in the same way that there's a lot of doors and rooms and things that are basically built to only exist above ground.
It makes you wonder if perhaps when if the Dwemer and the Reachmen kind of came into contact, would they have just had an agreement that, like, look, you're mostly subterranean, We want to rule the the caves and the mountains and live off the land on top of it. We can just kind of coexist. And this, Markarth could potentially have acted as some kind of like ambassadorial kind of location where the Dwemer exist in the Reach, and the Reachmen perhaps would have just allowed it to happen as well.
Potentially, or maybe it was a fallback plan after they tried to storm Markarth and got destroyed by by robots, essentially. Mm-hmm. Like, who knows? But
because there's a loading screen. It's a loading screen for ESO for Lost Valley Redoubt, which is like one of the locations. So long before elves or Nords conquered the region of Karth, tribes of humans inhabited the caves of the Druidark Mountains. In these dark places, they learned their new purpose, and it was the way they sang songs of fading dreams, yada yada. But basically, if you sort of buy the idea that it's interesting that they were in caves. And there are quite a few like barrows and sort of subterranean kind of Reachmen sort of areas and stuff. For example, with Lost Valley Redoubt, there is a subterranean sort of Reach folk barrow and stuff that has Nordic stuff built on top of it, and it's been repurposed as it was like conquered later on. It's interesting to think that, so in regards to like coming into contact with the Dwemer, that might actually be a problem, that they might, because the Reach folk might be more subterranean in some areas than you think. And also, Needs more broadly actually had a decent amount of subterranean sort of structures. So as you see in the Deathlands with the Dyraki Needs and so on, like building underground. And I wonder if that is, if you can kind of like symbolically see like as your steps from like cavemen kind of vibe stuff along to, oh, well, now we're building underground, but then it starts building out into the world. Maybe that's a bit of a whack theory, but like, do you know what I mean? Like symbolically, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it's just like caves and barrows versus like very, like, I guess that it's subterranean but at very surface level, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it could be if you look at like the loading screens or some of the different screens and stuff for that place. It's like, it's pretty deep looking. Like it's kind of, I guess, like in barrows, as in not like, oh, one little barrow, as in like Nordic barrows and the way that they go forever. Now, you could interpret this as like, it's just for gameplay reasons. So, you need a big dungeon. You can't have like what a real, barrows or catacombs aren't as big as these, things. But we can talk. There's so many tiny little details all around the place, so it's kind of hard. We might miss some inevitably, and it might come in like maybe there could be a new Reach folk video or something. But talking broadly about the great spirits of the Reach, we kind of more or less have talked to death or established about like Hircine's place as the lord of the mortal realm, the sort of creation story involving Lorcan and Namira being the queen of spirit realm. But some of the things that I find more interesting about the Reachmen too is that they are one of the few cultures that has any sort of like cultural reverence of Periite. Like outside of the Reachmen, I'm pretty sure it's just like, oh, individual little cults, like he's one of the Daedric princes, but they actually see him as one of the great spirits of the Reach, who is responsible for the natural order of things. The idea that
makes sense,
something will rise, and I guess that's even baked into their culture. The idea that like kind of like even the kings or something, if a king establishes himself, they will fall. It's just natural. Like it's kind of like revert to the mean. Like a bushfire will come and cleanse a forest, or this will happen. You know what I mean?
Or you can probably imagine, or a Forsworn uprising will come and cleanse this. This overreaching empire. Like you can see them fitting it into their ambitions as well, this kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, like I get the idea with the Reach folk that, I mentioned it before about the kind of the strength of the tribe and maybe not an obsession with permanence the way some other cultures have. And Periite would become very important in that sense that, if a disease breaks out in one group, then perhaps that's nature's way of letting you know that you're becoming too densely populated. You're not going to be able to maintain everyone's there's not going to be enough food for everyone, or living space is getting too cramped, things like that. So viewing that through a positive lens, that if the population decreases a bit, then the prosperity of those who survive will increase, does make sense for worshipping Periite.
There's a really nice quote here that says, but unlike other people, Reach folk see no malevolence in illness. Quite the contrary. Lives extinguished by disease make room for healthier, more vibrant Reach folk to take their place. Like wildfires, diseases serve as a revitalizing force of nature, a necessary check on the hazards of abundance. So yeah, like kind of like you're like saying like it's just letting it play out rather than, I guess you could say, like the Longhouse dynasty or something like that. Like that's too far, you know what I mean? Like out of...
They're very tough, aren't they? They like doing it tough and slogging along. There's a quote that's even like, dirt is a part of life. The real discipline comes from wading through mud, knowing that it'll be on you until you next find water.
Yeah.
You know,
an additional part, which I don't know might be worth some discussion too, about Periite is, so it says, I should note that in Periite's role in Reach Society mimics that of Akatosh in Aedric faiths in many crucial ways. Association with time, rigid natural order, draconic imagery, and so on lead me to believe that some cultural cross-pollination may have occurred during early interactions of Manamur and northwestern Tamriel. A heretical but fascinating thought. But you know how, I think in the Theories episode, the podcast last, we were kind of brought up talking about like Periite being like a younger brother of Akatosh or something who got shafted and got a poorer role and had to like deal with diseases and stuff, or and was rather coveting it, or maybe not, or rather they're connected in some way, like they're kind of different forms of order or so on. But it's interesting that then again the Reachmen don't really acknowledge Akatosh. They just have Periite sort of fulfills that role for them, I guess, the pitiless march of time.
Yeah. I find it interesting as well, kind of going back to Hircine and stuff, but I think it's cool to acknowledge that, you know, Hircine is very well known even outside of the Reach folk for providing the curse or blessing of lycanthropy, and how, you know, the Reachmen, as much as their culture may stay more stagnant or the same than other ones over time, they do like to change their form, don't they? I mean, they turn into Briarhearts, they turn into Hag-Ravens, or with Hircine, you know, they can turn into were-creatures like a werewolf, which you can imagine they would surely embrace, you know?
Yeah.
Like, they would like that kind of stuff. There's even some niche clan in Elder Scrolls Online called the Winterborn, and they have some leader called Ufrin Iceheart who has, instead of like a Briarheart, some kind of ice heart inside him. But then some of them actually transform into Lurcher, which is kind of like a golem-y tree type entity with this red glowing energy in the middle. To be fair, this is a do you know Angoth the Gravesinger as well? Like, there were necromantic cults of Reachmen as well. There's those that worshipped Molag Bal. And there's lots of stuff. They used a Spriggan apparently as a base, and then twisted that. You can put it on screen to create them into like lurchers as well.
Because you get there's a lot of variation in terms of cultural attitudes towards outsiders, and some of them are really quite brutal. I think, was it like the Cold Heart or something like that? They basically the ones where is it Cinder Heart or something, where they replace they rip out a sacrifice's heart and throw hot coals in or something like that. Like for Molag Bal, I think it was. You get some really brutal clans, some less so, but yeah, and you know, they all have different variations. One interesting thing when you're bringing up, this is from like a developer interview kind of stuff about the New Life Festival or so on, but it's brought up that that they actually, when the winter solstice ends and, you know, the days the days start to lengthen and so on, they believe that there is one of the aspects of Hircine, which the man beast one, hold on, I'm just trying to find the name again, the Storabeg, the man beast. He's a hungry werewolf and pursues the sun in an attempt to eat it, but then Rokubeg, the mighty bear, like tries to stop him and so on, and that's sort of like successful at stopping him at the turn of the solstice and stopping him from chasing it. It's just kind of cool. But it's another one of those sort of like, I guess it's somewhat riffing off a similar sort of like, you know, the wolves chasing the sun kind of thing in Nordic mythology.
I just going back to what I was saying about the Winterborn clan, they do have this leader that basically transforms into a lurcher while you fight him, which sounds like a very MMO boss battle type thing. But if you look at a lot of the clan outfits in Elder Scrolls Online, I'm not the biggest fan of like all of them, but like some of them I'll you can put this one on screen of Corinthak the Abomination. There's part of it I like, but it has this very big, like, feathery headdress that almost reminds me of like a Aelid or Elven thing, even though it's all made from like very natural materials. Still, it's just odd vibes.
I guess I'm more or less. That's the other thing too. Which is just, I think we kind of touched on it some, but it is strange that they're functionally a Stone Age civilization living amongst all others. Like, they've got magic to help them and so on, but all of their gear is basically made from animals, trees, or rocks and stuff. Or they have, sometimes there's additional things that, but it feels like they might kind of get a lot of the metallurgy kind of stuff from neighboring cultures and so on, or like picking it up from battles and war. Like, it doesn't necessarily seem like they would have a lot of blacksmiths, if you know what I mean, or a lot of like the craftsmen are also based on the materials that they know.
They put all their perk points into shaman stuff, and witches and rituals to make things. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think it's in here. There is like using like repurposed like metals from like Dwemer pieces and stuff like that into their gear and stuff, which you can imagine it's like kind of cool. But that also again implies it's more of a scavenged kind of thing, not. But they also have their own language, the Reachmen language and so on, which is isolated from the others. And, it's easier to have an isolated sort of language when you can live in the mountains doing your thing without Nords and stuff coming. But I don't know what else we want to talk about. There's.
I should clarify as well. Your brain sometimes just remembers things you said. Yeah. Angoff the Gravesinger had his own cult. I remember this because I was making a video on something to do with him. It's not necessarily a Reachmen clan that he was running, but there are clans that I'm pretty sure they do have a Molag Bal influence. Like, it's not as common, obviously, as your other ones.
Yeah.
But they worship Bal. I think you can easily imagine it in terms of like playing into that, like, death is inevitable, and Molag Bal loves inflicting pain and suffering, and if they think you grow from suffering, well, wouldn't be my first choice, but
yeah. The another little part that I just wanted to bring up too, which is interesting, is that they value hard work and everything, and that's a big part of their life. Like, an easy life is not a one to look for and so on. But they are really, at least the ones in the Markarth region, are really against theft. Like, theft is a massive no-no amongst the Reach folk, and like, such punishments of like having your hand amputated and so on. But they're quite. It's just interesting that in some sort of society like that they have different sort of, it kind of almost seems like murder, or like, well, not murder, but like they're around so much violence, it almost sounds funny that like theft is a big deal or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, but yeah,
Molag Bal confirmed. Molag Bal, spirit of torment and trouble, accept this and teach us to endure the struggle.
I mean, it does make sense as well, because if we're talking about other Reachmen have been around for so long, and they would have predated the foundation of Elysia's covenant with Akatosh, things like that. We know Molag Bal was wandering Tamriel, especially it was in Skyrim that he found LeMay Bal, who he turned into the first vampire. So you can imagine him wandering amongst the Reachmen in the early days when the Daedra had much stronger access to Nirn and having an influence on some of the cultures, and then enduring as this kind of spirit of like not an essential one, but one who would have a role in some clans.
Yeah, there is a clan member who actually says, you have it backwards, the Reach understands that hardship comes for us as surely as dung falls from a well-fed mammoth. Yeah, I remember that quote. Instead of moaning our sorrows, we embrace the pain as wisdom. This is why many of my kin revere Molag Bal. You must know the songs of the father of torment, he who schemes in the shadows. Molag Bal grants nothing but unexpected pain. Those of the Reach who venerate him appreciate the lessons he teaches. They grow resilient in his shadow.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before, but I think it's kind of likely that a lot of the Daedra worship stuff was the natural state of things, that a lot more humans would have this sort of like in native needs, even so on. Like, I'm talking like like their Nedic civilizations. But if you think about it, like even all concepts of the elven gods come with the elves, and the rest come with the Nords, and the Imperial Divines are all combinations of that. It's like, what kind of religions would have existed there beforehand? And if you had needs and stuff there, and if you look at the Reach folk as an isolate, and a lot of their religion centers around different great spirits and Daedra and so on, it's like maybe pre-colonization of all of these other races, that Daedra worship was much more widespread amongst early Need people, especially when you consider things like Hircine.
Oh, I'm sure it was. I mean, check out the video we've got coming. If it's not already out, I'm not sure what the timeline is. It may exist already. You may have already watched it. I'm not sure. There's a lot of Dragon Break tier stuff going on at the moment. We got, I don't know what videos going where, but they're coming.
Yeah. Does anyone else have things to like Reach folk areas to talk to? Like, there's lots of little details, like I was saying, but some of them it's just like, oh, this clan does this way, and it's kind of like,
I think understanding their spirituality, it puts a lot of what we know about them into context, and makes it more interesting. Like, a final thing on Molag Bal is, it seems like their spirituality is very Padamaic in nature, and there are similarities you can draw to the Khajiit pantheon and to the Dunmeri pantheon. And, you know, with the Dunmer, Molag Bal, for example, is considered one of the House of Troubles. You need to avoid him as much as possible. But perhaps the reason for that is because he tries to mess with the bloodlines, and perhaps in Dunmer culture, bloodlines are much more important to the people, whereas in Reach society, you know, as we talked about earlier, it's kind of like you can kind of become kin with people, not necessarily just by keeping your bloodline pure. Yeah. So the negatives associated with Molag Bal may not be quite so deal breaking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest thing about that is, like, clearly look at, you know, obviously there's Breton influence, and yet they do not consider themselves Bretons. You know, they're the Reach folk, and Bretons and all the other cultures don't see them as Bretons either. Which, I mean, they shouldn't, based on the things we've talked about. There's so many complexities and early days things going on. But yeah, I think, like you were saying, Scott, similar to the Goblins podcast, if we went through every single tribe, because there's a lot of tribes, you can find lots of little things. I mean, maybe we'll have to make a video on all these tribes, because, you know, these things are cool. There are lots of little details, little nuances between them. Lots of micro cultures, I guess.
That's the one, for me, the one saving, because I am so pro Elder Scrolls 6 and Hammerfell, but the one saving grace for Elder Scrolls 6 High Rock for me would be a good exploration of the Reachmen, like on the western reach.
All the hedge magic, druidy stuff, Reachmen, chuck in some Orsinium stuff potentially, and you'd have an awesome game still.
Yeah.
There's lots you can do.
There's.
But yeah, all right. Well, I suppose we have come to the end of the podcast. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Social media links are in the description, as always, and we look forward to nerding out with you again very soon.